that tells you a story.
So
And
when
story in prose, remember that.
a prose narrative is, therefore, if you look at your screen again, a prose narrative, the definition of the prose narrative is it's very simple, writing that tells a story, non-poetic writing.
That is crucial.
So prose narrative has a story, and it is a story which is told in prose. These are the two important features of the prose narrative. But then, if even a novel has prose, and even a novel is also a narrative, so what do you do then? How can we understand the rise of the novel? So if as Santosh has told you earlier, the novel as a form is something that grew in Europe, and mostly if you look at the history of the novel, you find that uh, Italy and Spain were ahead of the rest of Europe. And even France had the great Rabelais, who wrote Gargantua and another novel called Pantagruel as early as 1534. It was only much later that England got its novels. But before that, something else was happening in England, and that was a long tradition, a really long tradition of prose narratives in England. So, if you look at England, we have right from the 16th century a whole lot of prose narratives being written, and these are just a few of the important ones. So, right from Lyly to Congreve, prose narratives were thriving right from the 16th to the 18th century. But in the 18th century, we have a dramatic turn, a shift, something which moves away from prose narrative into something else, and that something else is the novel. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the difference between a prose novel and prose narrative and novels?
So as you
Look at
can
your
see,
screen.
prose narratives are defined, they have this following characteristics. The first one is lack of realism. They are not very realistic. And the other characteristic is improbable stories. They tell us very implausible, improbable stories, and their style is very theatrical. They are more interested in theatrical effectiveness than on questions of improbability and implausibility. So the style is more theatrical, and the language which is used is very grand and heightened and sometimes very classical, and they represent characters who are larger than life. That those are the characteristics of a prose narrative for you. And novels, if you look at novels, they are more realistic. They depict life as it is. The real life, and they tell us very plausible stories, not very fantastic, not
Absurd.
absurd stories. But and the style is very natural, and as we said, they use ordinary day-to-day prose,
Language.
and then there is the language is very communicative, and they represent characters which are lifelike, which are very close to you, and which are like they resemble you
Yeah.
more.
If you look at the two pictures on your screen, on one side you have the picture of Gulliver tied up by the Lilliputians. This is an unreal situation when you have a very large giant and very small men. This is an example of lack of realism. On the other side, you see the image of Robinson Crusoe, and he seems natural, lifelike, and we can imagine ourselves to be in his place as well.
And it is an interesting the way you have juxtaposed these two novels,
Yeah.
Gulliver's Travel on the one hand and Defoe on the other, Robinson Crusoe. I mean, these are they are very crucial juxtapositions in the sense that's why novels. I mean, when we talk of the first English novel, nobody talk. Though Swift's Gulliver's Travel was published earlier to Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, nobody
Talked about
traces the origin of the novel or the first novel as the Gulliver's Travel. Nobody talks about this. Whereas people talk of Robinson Crusoe as the
first
English novel.
But if you look at the similarities between novels, prose narratives, and romances, you find that it's not true that novels, prose narratives, and romances are only have differences. They have very important similarities as well.
Yeah, they are mostly in prose. Of course, you have some verse romances, but mostly they are written in prose, and they are fictional, and all of them they tell stories, and all carry elements of plot, character, location, and diction. They have a particular.
So if you all have a paper and pen handy, this is the time to note these similarities down. Prose, fictional character, tell a story, elements of plot, character, location, and diction. We now look at the beginnings of the first English novels. When were the first English novels written? Santosh, can you tell us something about this?
The first English novels were written in the first half of the 18th century. Of course, when we are talking about the rise of the English novel, usually the century that comes to you is the 18th century. But mostly the first early novels were written in the first half of the 18th century. And in fact, Congreve, as I told you earlier, I mean, he wrote his Incognita and he called it a novel. And in his preface, he has made the distinction between a romance and a novel, and we saw that.
Yeah.
And but many people consider Swift's Tale of the Tub to be a novel. But there are, I mean, literary historians have their own disagreements on which is the first novel and whether to consider it a novel or. But mostly, I mean, the most critics, I mean, they consider Robinson Crusoe, Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, to be the first English novel. And of course, some say that it is Richardson's Pamela, which came much later in the 1740s.
1719, the year of the publication of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, is considered to be a red letter day for the publishing of novels in England. But we have to consider here, why was it that the novel began or emerged, grew in the first half of the 18th century? What were the conditions which made it possible? How did novel reading become so popular that men, women, children, everybody started reading novels? In fact, the way our children watch TV today, in the same way we had novel reading in the 18th century. If you look at your screens, you will see that there are three main reasons for the rise of the novel in the 18th century. First and foremost is the rise of a middle class who could afford to buy books. if you cannot buy books, you cannot be a novel reader. So the first thing is extra money, with which you don't have to buy food, but you can buy books. But the second point is the rise of literacy. If you do not have people who read, novel reading can never become a common pursuit. So, the rise of literacy, especially among the middle classes and not just the upper classes, was a very important point. And third, and also very important social reason, is the emergence of leisure time or free time. This meant that some of the time people were working and the other times they were resting, and it is in this personal time of rest that novels could be read. And if you look at the image, which is of a painting painted in 1756, you see Madame Pompadour, an aristocrat of France, lying down in the afternoon reading a novel. But there were also other technical conditions which allowed novel reading to take place. One is the size of the book became small. If the book was very, very large, it's impossible to sit in the afternoon and read it. So the size of the book became small and it became easy to hold and read. The second reason is that books became cheaper, partly because the price of paper fell. And thirdly, since many people were buying books, because of the quantity of books being sold, that was a third reason for books becoming cheaper. So these were the historical conditions which led to the rise of the novel in the 18th century. Now, Santosh, if you look at the next slide, who were the most important writers? Can you tell us?
The writers who came in the first half of the 18th century, whom we call early novelists, they were, five of them. We have listed five major, the big five, we would say. Walter Allen calls them big four. Actually, he excludes Defoe from his list, and he keeps Fielding, Richardson, Sterne, and Smollett. But we have included Daniel Defoe, and we have five important major writers, all coming almost in a span of 40 years. So it was a great time for the novel.
In the next few slides, we are going to give you a little bit of information about the writings of these five authors. The first, Daniel Defoe. You already know he is credited with the first novel of the English language, Robinson Crusoe of 1719. Two of his other important works are Moll Flanders 1722, Roxana 1724. And the image you see on your screen is the first novel, the front page of the first novel published in the English language.
And it reads like the life and strange, surprising adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York, Mariner. The first novel happens to be an adventure novel.
Yeah. But if you look at what happens in this period of 40 years, you find that we don't have only one kind of novel being written. We don't have only novels of adventure being written. In fact, novels began to be written about a wide variety of themes containing a whole new set of ideas. Novels were written about men and women, rich and poor, England and abroad, and it was written about happy domestic life and violent life outside. We find that novels also took different forms, and one of the most important forms that we see, and that which is often asked in your exams as well, is the picaresque form. So, if you look at your slide, you will be able to look at what is the picaresque novel.
One of the important type of novels written in the early period was the Picaresque novel, and as you know, actually the tradition starts in Spain and it comes to England at a particular point of time, and the Henry Fielding and Tobias Smollett, they have written picaresque novels, and particularly Fielding's Mole Flander is
Fielding's Tom Jones and
Tobias
Tobias
Smollett's
Smollett's Humphrey Clinker. Look at the definition of the picaresque. They involve clever rogues or adventurers. So, picaresque novels comes from the word picaro from Spain, and picaro meant a rogue, something like Raj Kapoor in Avara. You can call Avara a picaresque film.
Even for that matter, Fielding's Jonathan Wild, that's also in the form of a picaresque novel, and it deals with English, underground criminal life.
Yeah.
And
on your screen is Tobias Smollett.